And she also serves as a special representative on gender issues for OSCE chairmanship. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks for participating earlier in the discussion as well. It was great to have you.
Well, it was a terrific discussion. Kudos to everyone. And thank you, Sahana, for bringing this together with the partnership of the Dallaire Centre of Excellence for Peace and Security and the MINDS program at Canada. We at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security are working with Canada presently on the ELSI initiative, which I think everybody knows is about integrating gender into peacekeeping more effectively. And again, it will be the research and the data and the conclusions that come out of that that I think will be helpful to all of us, and especially to peace operations. But I have to say that I very much appreciate Canada's leadership. As Sahana mentioned, I do some work at the OSCE, and yesterday we were marking the anniversary of 1325. And the Canadian ambassador, who's new this term, just laid everything out in a way that was so compelling and coherent, but most of all committed to this agenda. And it was extremely refreshing. So go Canada, and keep all of us faithful to these issues. You know, Don said during the last panel that it was advantageous to come last, and I'm not so sure about that. Because not being able to have heard what happened over the last couple days, I think it is a bit disadvantageous. But I will just look to my experience in terms of these issues that you've been grappling with, and see if at the conclusion it adds anything to what I'm sure has been just an extraordinary discussion. And if the last panel was anything like the last 2 days, I can only imagine what I've missed. But I think it's particularly important to gather on this anniversary of 1325, this 20th anniversary, to take stock of what's worked, what needs improvement. I think many of us who've been involved in this space for a while believe that our progress has been halting, and we really need to improve the situation. But rarely in these discussions is there an opportunity to talk about curricula and training, and how one really transfers this information to others who act in a operational capacity, and how we get the best of our academicians and our researchers and our data crunchers to understand what's really going on. And I must confess, one of my great discouragements in government, especially working as the State Department does in so many conflict areas from a diplomatic point of view, the fact that we would always say the same thing. The solution was always the same. Everybody would sit at the table. There wasn't a new idea, and it didn't matter that what was tried before failed, but that was what was on the table again. And one of the things that happened, thanks to the vision of a number of people and the receptivity of the president of Georgetown, was that we set up the Georgetown Institute in many ways to try to do something about the frustration that so many of us felt, and to have a place where we could look at the issue of women, peace, and security, not in any way that didn't include others who were operating in this space, but it was our sole and is our sole raison d'etre to really understand. And more than that, you know, you talked about the tensions in the last panel, the tensions between civil society and the military. Well, there are also tensions between the academic sector and people who are doing the practical work that we do in development or diplomacy or with the military. And I think those gaps have to be bridged. And one of the things we actually set up was a programmatic framework on bridging theory and practice. Let's get the actors together in all sides of this so we can do a better job of transmitting to the people who are in operations of all kind what they need to know and what could be useful to them. I think this whole area of understanding and education and knowledge transmission is so critically important, because it's hard to understand if we don't do this part well, how we really do improve our policy and programmatic work generally, but certainly specifically to women, peace, and security. And I'll go back to what Mickey talked about some, and Don talked about some, in terms of the United States National Action Plan. We were Johnny come latelys to the table. There were many others who had preceded us in adopting national action plans, including NATO and EU. Both had plans, and we didn't. But in the process of putting it together, it became clear that once we had it, we really needed to do justice by the people whom it was going to affect: the diplomats, the development officers, the military officers. And in fact, when President Obama launched the National Action Plan, he said, this is for us to do this work differently, to do that diplomatic work and defense work differently, to adopt a gender lens, so that we are trying to integrate this, not add it on, integrate it to what we are doing in our normal operations. And one of the things that took a great deal of time and a lot of people's effort was to work with the Foreign Service Institute, which is the place that does the training, the educational, foundational work for our diplomats, to ensure that not only did we create new courses that would be useful to this, but also integrated into what existed in areas that were related to this work. And so often um, it it was not viewed as an imposition to work on this agenda, but the big question was, how do we do it? And I still think that that's an issue. What are those practices, and how can we bring those to the fore in the educational work that we do, so that what others have done successfully and made work is transmitted to others who are starting out, perhaps, or don't have that practical experience or those practical examples. Another thing that was very clear when we were going through the adoption of our national action plan, it was an interagency operation. So at the table was Ambassador Steinberg for USAID, and we had our military counterparts from the Department of Defense and Homeland Security, et cetera. And it was also clear that while it was easier for those of us from the State Department or USAID to grapple with this and understand why we needed to do it, the goodwill was there from the Defense Agency, from our Department of Defense, but there was also in the back of the minds of the participants this sense: how do we get this across? How are we going to sell this? How are we going to make it acceptable? And it was a suggestion, actually, from one of the representatives of DoD, that it not just be a presidential directive to have a national action plan on women, peace, and security, but that it actually be issued as an executive order, because, as he said, the military would understand an executive order better than it would a presidential directive. So this is not easy. And for those of you who are doing this in a much more intimate way in your everyday efforts, I salute you, and I understand how difficult it can be. And then when many of us were leaving government at the time, always mindful that we had to address curricula, we had to address training, we had to train people who were in these operations and now having something else put on the table for them, or those who were coming up who had no experience. And another one of the first things we did, which I'm emphasizing because I think it goes to the heart of focusing on curricula, was to create a handbook. It was actually a hard copy book that the National Defense University put out. We went to NDU and we said, you know, this is going to be critical. It's got to get into the NDU curricula. Well, we don't have any materials. We don't know the first of what we're supposed to do here. And this was a very elementary way to start the process. But it had chapters from people like General Stavridis talking about why this is important, or Admiral Mullins, or Ambassador Steinberg, or Patrick Kammert, General Kammert, who is so active in peacekeeping for the Dutch, so that you had a credibility, a validation. You had people who were respected as experts and leaders in the field saying, this is important, pay attention. But all of that said, it is still not the easiest of assignments. And I think that's probably reflected, has been reflected in much of your discussions today. So I think we need better integration. To me, the critical word is integration. To get this into the bowels of our decision-making processes at whatever levels those are happening, within ministries, within government agencies and departments, but we also need interconnectedness among them. And I think we have less of the latter than we often do of the former. And I think that would help us. It came up with Don's alphabet stew about, is this feminist, human rights, operational, whatever the word was. And I think that that's some of what went into our saying throughout our work at the department, because it was so hard to do some of this, was it's not just the right thing to do. It is fundamentally at its core about human rights, but it is the smart thing to do. It is the strategic thing to do. And I think for those who weren't persuaded on the former, understanding that this may actually enhance their work effectiveness, enhance the outcomes they were trying to produce, was something that made it more compelling. So, you know, there's a lot of thought that has to go into what's the best way to make these arguments. Women bring, as has been said, I'm not saying anything new here, women bring necessary and distinctive contributions to the security sector. One of the issues in our earliest days at the Institute was this understanding, again, of the need to explain this in military ways that went to the heart of operational effectiveness. If I heard two words once, I heard them 1,000 times. How does this contribute to operational effectiveness? And we were fortunate to have in our security studies program at the time, a Swedish expert in this field who had done a lot of work on Sweden's military. Many of you may know Robert Egnell. He today is the head of the Swedish Defense University. In fact, the two of us were participating in a NATO 1325 event a few days ago. But I would advise consulting with him if he can be a resource, because he's done some really seminal work, and in fact, some very practical work with DOD in those years to try to help the people who were mid-level so that they could take this up the ladder and down the ladder. I personally think when you've got the top engaged and sending the signals that this matters, the rest comes easier. When you're dealt with this assignment and you're in the middle and struggling to interest the top and make the contribution that has to happen at that level of people on the ground, it is very hard. So part of what he was trying to do with some of the mid-level important officials at DOD was help them put together this operational effectiveness piece. So women do bring distinctive contributions to the security sector. And what I have seen is more and more countries are demonstrating the difference that committed leadership is making in recruiting, in promoting and retaining women in the security sector. There are so many security sector issues that really dovetail with the need for a gender perspective. I think of the work that our FETs, our female engagement teams, did in Afghanistan. And I met with a group of them a few years ago, and they were telling me how much their counterparts from some of the European PRTs who were also militarily engaged in Afghanistan saw what they were able to do, how they were able to go in a very traditional society, go into parts of the society that the male military people could not, the kinds of relationships that were being forged, the early warning signals that were coming to them, the other kinds of intelligence they were getting. And their counterparts said to them, is there a book about all of this? Is there a manual? Is there something we can consult? Well, nothing existed. And the women FETs actually created a handbook. And because they couldn't get anybody in the Pentagon interested in this at the time. And yet it had a valuable role that they were playing, and that handbook had a valuable role that it was playing with others who wanted to learn from it. You know, you had discussion in this last session about the tensions between civil society and military, and I think so much of it really is rooted in the perceptions that we bring with us, whoever we are, as to perhaps one being hostile to the other and vice versa. But in reform that was taking place in Ukraine under their National Action Program, a lot of work has gone into defense and policing. In defense, for example, they had what has been termed the Invisible Battalion, because when the attack came from Russia, it was a ragtag band that went to really defend the country, and many were women who were not supposed to be involved in conflict, in combat. They turned out to be the Invisible Battalion, celebrated these days, but it really ushered in that and the pressure of their National Action Plan, which was the only one really written in the midst of conflict, began to bring changes in their Ministry of Defense that now has, a role for women that is quite striking. And women veterans are one of the most powerful civil society groups now in the country. But they were reforming their police. And this is what I wanted to say was, violence against women is a huge problem in many places. It's pervasive just about everywhere, but a really big problem there. And there was such suspicion of the police because the police were virtually all male. They are critical to understanding these issues, but they were not really acting in accordance with the role that they should have been playing. But they brought in more women into policing, and it has had an incredible difference. Massive communication campaigns in terms of how the police are your friends, they are there to help you, not just on this issue, but on avoiding corruption, really addressing law enforcement. I had an OSCE driver in Kiev. This is getting a little off, but he told me the day that the police patrol reform went into effect, he got a ticket that day. And I said, well, how do you feel about that? Was it demoralizing because of where his van was parked? And he said, no, I want to celebrate because it has said no parking here for as long as I can remember. And nobody ever did anything about it. And now all of a sudden, the laws were being enforced and there was change coming. So there's no monopoly on who does it best, men or women, but we do need the diversity. Diversity is a strength. And it happens in peacekeeping more and more. I think General Cameron is certainly a great example. But the current Undersecretary of the UN, Lacroix, as heading up the peacekeeping missions, which has had its problems, needless to say, he has been working within the peacekeepers for closer relationships with civil society, and they recently held a really impressive discussion of women representatives from several countries in Africa who were critical to holding the peace in areas that are just coming out of conflict. And he said, we couldn't do this without them. They've become so essential. Now, one of the problems is we don't know about this. Unless we're in a panel or in a discussion, it really isn't integrated even into coursework or into training. So I just think we need to do a much better job of getting these practices that have been effective um, into the work that we're all doing. And then, of course, we all know that women are differently and disproportionately affected by conflict, and sexual and gender-based violence remains an area of great vulnerability for them. So again, what the military's been doing in so many of our training programs has been so essential to really addressing that. I wanted to also mention that I think some of the best materials, and many of you are familiar with them, do happen in some of the regional security organizations, come out of DCAF, come out of some of the multilats. And again, I'm not sure how much of that gets transferred into what we're trying to do, or many of you are trying to do in our military academic settings as well. So that's kind of how I come to this issue, having been in civil society, in government, and now in academia, and trying to create greater intersectionality among all of the sectors that need to be involved in this. I'd like to mention a couple of things that we're doing at Georgetown that might be of interest to you. One is we've just introduced a certificate in gender, peace, and security. And the reason for that, obviously, is to support students who want to augment their understanding of the dynamics between gender and international peace and security. It's in the graduate program now. It's in the School of Foreign Service program. It's where we have a lot of military graduate students. And this certificate, particularly for those who might go into government work, development work, becomes something that demonstrates they have acquired a skill set that is important for them in the jobs market and in making the contribution to mainstreaming a gender perspective into their work in the future. As the international community becomes more and more engaged in recognizing the importance of women's participation in peace and security, we think that something like the certificate will provide essential analysis, expertise, and practical skills. The students have to take some specific extra courses, and then they can take courses that are relevant if they, with their professors in those courses, can inject a gender component in their coursework, mostly in their papers. So we've tried to make it both easier for them so that they're not doubling up with courses they can't possibly begin to manage because there would be too many, but also to provide them with this opportunity to be able to develop this expertise that they wouldn't get otherwise. And if anybody's interested in knowing more about this, there's lots of detail on it that we would be more than happy to share with you. The other thing we did, in fact, did yesterday, and it highlights the importance of diversity and inclusion to this larger WPS discussion. That is with us today in spades in every segment of professional work, and certainly writ large in our societies, that we have to understand diversity, we have to understand the biases, and we have to understand attitudes that are problematic, and we've got to begin to do something about it. But we have to understand the richness of diversity if we can get that across in ways that are useful and enhancing. So yesterday we announced resources to diversify syllabi and foster inclusion in higher education. And we did this because we've seen a growing demand from colleges and universities. It's often pushed by the students. It's pushed by alumni who increasingly see the importance of D&I in their work outside of academia proper. And the demand today for a greater commitment to this area. So what we've done is list resources, these are on our website, that are well cited by authors from underrepresented communities on topics central to international relations. So this enables professors who normally would have coursework, recommended readings, required readings that constantly reiterate the same group of people without bringing in equally competent, well-known aspects of the dimension that diversity would bring to that coursework. When you're training diplomats or you're training people in the military, they're going to be all over the world. The world is not a parochial space. And so we find that this is really essential to enhancing the quality of their education and their exposure to different perspectives that come out of a more diverse set of citations that of authors that they could be tapping. We also set up a council on diversity and inclusion in international relations, and this is deans and directors of programs across the United States now. It includes some of the Ivy schools, it includes public universities, it includes historic Black colleges, it includes one of the military defense universities, and it's an attempt for key people in academia who care about diversity and inclusion and how they get that across, inculcate it, integrate it, to come together and really talk through some of the impediments, some of what's working, the kinds of things that make a difference. And as I was thinking about it, it might be something, Sahana, that under our secure future or other ways that the continuation of what you started here can be tapped. So there is a place to come together and not just talk through these issues, but really exchange knowledge and exchange best practices, which everybody wants to really be able to access. And lastly, let me just mention that in the context of curricula, in the context of our pedagogical work, we really do need to include the new threats. You know, those range from cyber to climate to terrorism to the humanitarian crises. The military is going to be dealing with these, is dealing with them, as are the other operatives, particularly in the government sector, but certainly belong in civil society for sure. And I know that Beth and Mickey already touched on this, but I do want to mention climate because this is an area of growing interest. I never thought I'd even hear a portion of a presidential debate in the United States focused on climate after what we've been doing to devalue science and evidence, et cetera. But it is a ultimate threat multiplier. And I think as we're thinking about our work, present and future, we need to better understand the risk in peace and security. It is the great risk. And the United Nations Security Council, again, in addressing women, peace, and security, underscored the nexus between gender, climate, and conflict. And, you know, future conflicts and political tensions are going to be exacerbated. They're all already being exacerbated by vanishing natural resources, especially water. Climate displacement is already creating a new class of climate refugees. You see this coming out of Central America. You see it in Africa, the whole Chad area, absorbing refugees from whose life's work is in the agriculture sector, and they can no longer plant and feed themselves and their families and eke out an existence. You see it, as Mickey mentioned, certainly if you are in the Pacific. I was at an event where the women from the Pacific Islands, one of them introduced herself by saying, we are the first island to be completely covered in water. And when it happens now, when the storms come in, we are half covered in water. To understand what this is beginning to mean, from wildfires to what's happening again, even in the middle of the United States, this is only going to get worse. And we need to factor in, again, a gender perspective on all of this as well. In fragile and conflict affected settings where governance is limited or ineffective, the consequences of climate interact with other stresses to compound existing tensions that can disrupt fragile peace processes or escalate into violence. Research that we've conducted on the Institute on Gender, Climate, and Security has made clear the urgent need for gender responsive action to tackle these linked crises. Intervention around natural resources, the environment, climate change provides significant opportunities for women's political and economic leadership and strengthen their contribution to peace. Inclusive peace needs to happen on the front lines of climate change as well. And the Women, Peace, and Security framework needs to be integrated into our overall actions in addressing this current and certainly future threat. And if we've learned anything from COVID, and I'm not sure that we have, but if we haven't understood the disproportionate impacts that COVID has had on women, from the economic dislocation to their being on the front lines, to what's happening in families, to the staggering, alarming rates of domestic violence, we have to understand that in responses, we have to have a gender understanding of the differences that males and females often separately experience, differently experience, disparately experience. And that will certainly be true of climate in spades. And let me just touch on one other area that Mickey also mentioned, and that's the present and future threat that terrorism, radical extremism, et cetera, represents. So that in countering terrorism and violent extremism, the Security Council adopted a resolution, as he mentioned, 5 years ago, and added it to Women, Peace, and Security, calling on states to integrate gender as a cross-cutting issue in developing strategies to counter terrorism and violent extremism, and to ensure the participation and leadership of women in organizations in countering this. Again, men and women are differently impacted. Terrorist groups have targeted women and perpetrated crimes of sexual violence against them. But women have also been and continue to be victims of terrorism in a broad way in their communities and beyond the purposeful targeting in situations. Terrorists have also radicalized and attracted women, including in the West, as we all know, and successfully done that to their nefarious cause. So women are engaged both in countering extremism and promoting violent extremism. And this reality must be understood to address the threat that is posed so that we can do it much more effectively. I know that the State Department, I'm sure DOD, there's been huge efforts within governments to figure out the right thing to do. The only solution is not a military operations solution. So we really have to come together to understand how is this demonstrating itself and how can we rely on a gender perspective in this. Because efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism need to factor in the fact that women in their families, acting through organizations in their communities, are often the early warning in identifying and preventing radicalization. They identify security concerns, and they are often the critical interlocutors within communities, law enforcement, institutions, etc. So they have a vital role to play. And again, as we look at the new or the ongoing and new threats, this needs to be factored into that women, peace, and security curriculum. Let me just say, finally, that I have often thought about the words of Adrian Foster. Some of you may know him. He was a British general who worked in peacekeeping for a long time. And he said, after his years of experience, and I think you heard this from some of the panelists this afternoon, he said, this is no longer an option. We can no longer treat this as an option. It is a necessity. And we have to figure out how we incorporate it so that we can be that much more effective in the work that each of us does. As difficult as this may be, it is what is in our interest, whether we're doing our work in civil society, in development, in defense work, in diplomatic work, but I think particularly for the purposes of this conference, to try and understand how that women, peace, and security agenda that was laid out 20 years ago by the Security Council can really be much more impactful, and that we understand why it's necessary and isn't just an add-on. And I will end there.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer. That was really covered so much ground, and it just shows us how much we have to do. I'm mindful of the time, but I do want to allow for one question, at least. I'm gonna ask if, before I go to the question that I wanna ask if anyone in our group would like to raise their hand or ask a question verbally as the last question of the day. We have a shy group now.
Well, it's a Friday afternoon and you've been at it a long time.
Yes, we have. Oh, I think I see Corey. Okay, Corey, unmute yourself, please. Thank you.
Hi, ma'am. This is Corey Flesser from the Joint Staff. It's great to see you, and thank you for your comments. I think, the discussions we've heard from last week have all been really helpful in terms of like the next kind of steps that we need to take, especially from a military perspective. And I think if you could look maybe 2 to 3 years out and say, well, what are the sort of near-term changes that you would like to see within the military education system from your vantage point? I think a lot of the folks in this room would like to hear that perspective as well. Thanks.
Well, Corey, I don't have any magic bullets, and let me first of all thank you for the work you're doing at Joint Chiefs. And it is not easy, as we know. But I think if we can really address this point of operational effectiveness, it has in many ways been that albatross, I feel, on the shoulders of military personnel like yourself, who come and say, look, I know why we need to do this, but this is what I'm getting in response. And I think somehow our curricula, what we're transferring in all of those ways that we are transferring knowledge, that we address this in a much more practical way, instead of just putting out normative rules or theories or frameworks, because I think it's that divorce, that disconnect between, yeah, it sounds like it's okay stuff. It's, you know, something I guess I have to know, but what does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with my work in the military? What does it have to do with making us more effective? And I think the more that we can inject the kinds of practical applications from the field and from leadership that really impact this space, the much more successful we're going to be. Because what we do have now is this disconnect. We've got academicians looking at all kinds of serious issues and saying, you know, if you looked at the data, you would really incorporate this. But we've got the practical applicators who either aren't aware or aren't connected to it at all. And I think we've got to find a way to bridge that chasm.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that is a good note for us to end our conference on.